So to begin with, Jarnail Singh has really sort of become an epic figure in modern Sikh history. And I want to go through his early life really quickly. What's really unique about Jarnail Singh's life is that he came from a very humble background. He was the youngest of a large family. His father had married twice because his first wife had died. And so he was the youngest of the second wife, and he wasn't treated too well by his father, to be honest. And Jarnail Singh, even later on, in his speeches, you can hear him talk where he says, I live in a small hut, and people sort of make fun of me. But he goes, what's good about living in a hut is that when, you can get up and pack easily, and you can't be bought out too easily. He goes, I'm comfortable wherever I am. And that was one of his really key aspects of his personality that made him so appealing to regular Punjabis, to regular Sikhs, was that he was very much the first leader that the Sikh nation had seen in many generations who was totally uncorruptible, who could not be bought out, who would not turn out to be a sellout. And we can see also from a very young age that Baba Jarnail Singh had a really intense connection with Gurmat. That's going to be one of our themes today. So he became Jathedar of what we call the Pindarwale Taksal or the Damdami Taksal in 1977. And his really first simple message was very, as we spoke earlier, it was focused on three key issues: Nashe Shakdo, Amrit Shakdo, Gursikh Bano. That was it. And he'd sort of go around. And what's interesting to note that doesn't really get reported on too much was that his early supporters, in large numbers, were women. So women really supported his movement at the beginning before men did. And the reason why was because they were seeing in their family, in the patriarchal society that Punjab was, that with men off drinking and doing drugs and so forth, that their homes were falling apart. There was a lot of domestic violence going on. There was a lot of really terrible things happening in Punjab socially. And Jarnail Singh offered a solution to these problems that wasn't coming from any other side, any other avenue. His level of his personal charisma was really impressive. And I want us to think about, does anyone know how old he was when he took over as Jathedar? 30? He was 30 years old, yes. Just like Guru Gobind Singh Ji, I'm not comparing Baba Jarnail Singh to Guru Gobind Singh, but I'm saying that this is a common critique of Sikhi, is that when we're viewed with especially with our kirbans or with our hatyar or shastras, we are then considered to be violent. But from a Sikh perspective, these are tools of love and compassion that are used to make the world a better place. And so Jarnail Singh's message was very loving. And even later on, I would encourage you to look and read his speeches directly. And I brought a book here that you can all get online, it has all the speeches translated really well. Is that his personal interactions with people, be they Hindu, be they Sikhs who are not Amritdhari or not Gestatari, were always very respectful. When people would come to him and if they didn't have gas, he would bring them close to him and he would sit them down next to him and he would joke around with them. And he wouldn't shun them, he wouldn't judge them, he wouldn't look down on them. It was all very much done with love and compassion. He would kind of joke around with them. He'd say, when are you going to become my brother? When are you going to become my sister? When are you going to join me and my family? This sort of idea, let's join together and let's follow our Guru. It was very coming from a place of love and kindness. It wasn't from a place of judging people. And we can see here that his appeal was not this appeal of, he gets compared in the West to like Osama bin Laden just because he's a tall guy with a turban, I think, and because he's considered to be a mastermind terrorist. But if you actually read his words and the way he was teaching, he was very non-judgmental. And of course, from a Sikh perspective, it's very different than, a Taliban or a Wahhabi Muslim perspective where you're trying to convert everyone. He had very good relationships with Muslim and Hindu leaders at the time as well. So many of us know, of course, that in 1978 there was a massacre in Amritsar, the Sakhi, when 13 Sikhs led by Fauja Singh were shaheed. And we see on the right-hand side Baba Jarnail Singh helping by Harmeet Singh, right? Sorry, I'm having a mental. He does Kirtan, AKJ in Australia. Amol Singh, thank you, sorry. That's by Amol Singh up there, who was shot in 78, and Baba Jarnail Singh supporting him at the funeral. So the massacre in Amritsar in 1978 was not an isolated event. Instead, it was the beginning of a pattern, unfortunately. And so between 78 and 1982, 186 were killed. So then when we compare that to the numbers that we know from 84, it doesn't sound that big. But I want us to put ourselves in the mentality of Sikhs in India at that time. Sikhs in India in the early 80s or 70s were like Sikhs in Canada today. You know, they felt comfortable in the country. This was their country. Their forefathers had fought for this country. Their not only forefathers, their ancestors had fought to create India, and they felt comfortable there. It was their country. They were in politics, they were in the army, they were in sports, and so on. So when Sikhs start to get killed by either the state or by state-backed groups like the Nirgari movement, and there's nobody arrested, nobody taken to court, nobody sent to jail, nobody charged with any crimes, and there's total impunity, it's a very traumatic experience. And the types of massacres that were happening were really awful too. And these are all very well documented, and you can go and find out. If I can give a few examples where, you know, there was a young Sikh, I forgot his name now, who was a soldier, and some guns went missing in the army where he was stationed, and they blamed him without any evidence. And they ended up torturing him to death. And they tortured him to death by pulling off his fingernails and then cutting open his stomach and stuffing chili peppers in them. This is a really awful way to kill a person. There's instances in Haryana and Rajasthan of young Sikh women and young Sikh girls, some as young as 12 years old, being paraded naked up and down villages. And also instances of Guru Granth Sahib just being thrown into streets and desecrated. So these types of events were happening starting in '78. And the response from the Panthic leadership was just very, very, okay, we're going to protest, we're going to write a letter to Delhi, we're going to say this is terrible, it shouldn't happen, and that was sort of the end of it. And nothing was being done. So we need to understand the context of what was going on in Punjab and in India at that time. The Dharmiya Morcha had been started in the mid-70s by the Akali Dal. The Akali Dal was a Sikh political party. And the Dharmiya Morcha was fighting for something called the Anandpur Resolution. The Anandpur Resolution was largely written by that man, Santbir Singh, who's called many times the father of Khalistan. We can see him there having a discussion with Bhai Jarnail Singh. Santbir Singh is one of the great intellectuals of Sikh history. His books on Sikhi are really amazing as well. I encourage everyone to read them. And the Anandpur Resolution's basic goals were three in nature. One was devolved power to the states. So you know how Quebec has their own EI, and Quebec has their own immigration system, and Quebec has their, let's see what else, their own, they collect their own taxes as well. They don't fall under Revenue Canada. That, Quebec has more power than what the Sikhs were asking for Punjab back then, to put it in context. They were asking for control over education and resources, which is something that all provinces in Canada have. That's it. They weren't asking for control of foreign affairs. They weren't asking for control of the army. They weren't asking control of banking or financial anything. Education and internal resource management. That was it, very basic. In addition, they were asking for that not only for Punjab but for all states. This was really a campaign to help everyone in India. Thirdly, they were asking for basic religious rights and freedoms for minorities, which I think we can all agree with isn't too revolutionary. Finally, they were asking for the eradication of caste system and gender and caste inequality. And they were asking for the government to take concrete measures to try to defeat these social inequalities. So it was really much a really idealistic document, and it was a pretty amazing document. You guys can find it online and read it. It's not very long, it's a couple pages. And that is essentially what the Sikh Panth was fighting for from the 70s to the 80s. This is not some huge revolutionary campaign. It's not about asking for an independent state. It's not about trying to break up India. It's nothing like that at all. So we need to be very careful when Jarnail Singh is called a terrorist. Well, then you ask, well, what was he fighting for? He's fighting for the Dharmiya Morcha. He's fighting for the Anandpur Resolution. You ask the person, what was the Anandpur Resolution asking for? It's asking for these very basic things. And people should be able, we need to learn what was in that, because many Sikhs died for the Anandpur Resolution, and we need to understand what it was that they were fighting for and whether that really is a terrorist cause. Now, this is especially appropriate because we're here in a university. A big component of Bhai Jarnail Singh's movement was the student movement. So many of you know the gentleman on the right is Shaheed Bhai Singh, who was the son of the leader of the Dixie before Bhai Jarnail Singh. And him and Jarnail Singh were best friends essentially. And he was elected head of what was called the All India Sikh Students Federation, which is what a lot of our SSAs are based on. So in the 1940s, the Akali Dal decided to create a youth wing in support of the revolutionary movement against Britain. And that youth wing was called the All India Sikh Students Federation. And it was modeled after the All India Muslim League, All India Muslim Students League. And this movement had been going on, but it kind of been dying down, to be honest. Its leadership was kind of groomed to become Akali Dal leadership, and it wasn't really engaging with students anymore. Amrik Singh, after taking it over, was such an effective leader and so good at organizing that within 3 years, membership had gone from 10,000 to 100,000, which is just unbelievable. And so all over India, not just in Punjab, in colleges and universities, people were holding Gurmat camps, they were holding Akhand Paths, they were having lessons, they were doing kirtans, they were doing samagams, and they were reconnecting with the Guru, reconnecting with Sikhi, they were teaching Sikhi, people were getting involved in the community, and people were also, as is natural for Sikhs, becoming socially and politically conscious. And that was really one of the main backbones of the 84 movement. So really, when we talk about where do we go now, and we'll talk about that later, one of the places we go is we start at the student. Because if we look at Panthic history, everything that the Panth has done in terms of big things has been done by people who are young. People in their 20s and before they turn 30. After you turn 30, you got kids, get married, and it's a lot harder to be revolutionary. So this is a time when you're not tied down to be revolutionary. And if we look, and I'm not talking about this, I'm even talking about Singh Sabaler, Bhai Singh, Gyani Singh, Professor Gurmat Singh, when those guys, we always see their pictures when they're old. When they started off, they were in their 20s. And if we go back further to the revolutionaries from Banda Singh Bahadur's time or during the missile time, they were all young. In fact, there used to be two Khalsa armies, the Buddha Dal and the Tarna Dal. You guys have heard this, right? Do you guys know how old you have to be in the Buddha Dal? Anyone have any idea? Anyone want to guess?
No idea.
You have to be 35 to be in the Buddha Dal, okay? Once you're 35, you're considered old. So that was the Sikh philosophy. Along with the student aspect, is also a popular movement. Like I told you before, that this was really supported in the early days, especially by women, and women played an central component. The young Bibi doing kirtan there, she was Shaheed in '84. She was Harmeet Singh Sandhu's wife. Do you remember her name, Padre? I'm sorry, I forgot her name. I have her name in a book here. We can find it later. But she was one of two women who were Shaheed in the attack who were actual fighters, so not as innocent civilians. Bhai Jarnail Singh started to make speeches around the complex. First started, he eventually ended up on top of Langar building and in the Dewan Manji Hall. If you guys have been to the Barsad complex, those buildings are still there today. And these daily speeches were just incredible. They were packed full of people. And does anyone know how morchas work? How this idea of Sikh nonviolent protests worked from the 1920s onwards? The sort of strategy is that a group of people come from a village or a city or a town or a jatha or a kirtan group, whatever. They come, they matha take at the Barsad, they go to a Akal Tak and they do ardas and they say, we're going to go get arrested today. We may get Shaheed, Guruji give us strength. Then they go and listen to the speeches or give a slope bit. And then they go off and they do their protest, and then they're arrested. And so this strategy worked really well against the British. Because the British, what would they do? They would have to book everyone, they'd have to charge everyone, they'd have to process everyone, give everyone a court date. And so sending everyone, thousands and thousands of people through the system really shut down the British colonial machine. And that's how Britain ran India, you know? And that's why nonviolent protests worked against the British. But does anyone know what the Indian government's response to the nonviolent protest was? Do you know what they did with these people who were arrested?
Just kept locking them up, right?
Was there?
There was over 100,000 arrests. Just kept throwing them in jail.
They kept throwing them in jail, but more so, they would let most of the regular people go. They would torture the Jathedars, the leaders. They'd keep them, and then they would let everyone else go. And so they weren't bothered to give trials. They didn't care. There was no rule of law. So the strategy wasn't working. At the same time, as the movement is getting bigger, attacks on Sikhs are increasing. So we're not going to go into too many of the details. It gets a little bit arcane. But essentially, Baba Jarnail Singh joined up with the Akali Dal leadership. He was the president of the Akali Dal, Harmeet Singh Agrawal, and they joined their movements together officially. And Baba Jarnail Singh did an ardas at Akal Takht saying that I will not stop until an Anandpur Resolution has been ratified. So for a Sikh, an ardas is a very, very, very serious business. It's not something that you take lightly. And Ben, you were at TSR, and we had spoken about Sakha Panja Sahib. You know, Sakha Panja Sahib really is just a story about how important Ardas of Langar is. That Sikhs were getting arrested at Guru Ka Bagh Morcha, which was a morcha against protest against the British government, control of Guru Ka Bagh Gurdwara. And the Sangat at Panja Sahib said, we can't be there at Guru Ka Bagh. We want to help our brothers and sisters who have been arrested. We are going to make langar for them. And we're going to stop the train. And they did ardas. They said, doesn't matter what, we're going to stop the train and give langar. And so when the train came and the train wouldn't stop, we have all seen the picture. What did they do? They sat down on the tracks to stop the train, just to feed other Sikhs langar. So when we think about langar, we should really understand what a huge concept, how important langar is. Sikhs were willing to die for langar, and willing to die to keep their ardas. So for Jarnail Singh, his ardas was very important. He was not going to back down. But for the Akali leadership, doing these ardasas in front of the Rars of Akal Takht were like not a big deal. They would do ardas, and then behind the scenes they would negotiate with the government. So they would play this sort of role with the Sikh population. We're really, really standing with you. We're not going to stop. We're going to die. We're not going to give up until all our demands have been met. But then they would go on and make some deals. This had sort of been the ongoing pattern of Sikh leadership from the 1960s onwards, with Master Tara Singh, Sant Jarnail Singh, Santbir Singh, and all these other Akali Dal leaders all breaking promises. And many of them were really stupid promises, like we're not going to eat until we die, we're going to burn ourselves alive in Akal Takht, and then at the last minute, you know, Indira Gandhi would say, oh no, we'll have a meeting with you. It was all just a big drama, and it really was just to manipulate the Sikh population. And so Jarnail Singh wasn't going to do that. He took his promise very seriously, whereas they didn't. And as he became more and more powerful and more popular, they became more and more uncomfortable. And they started actively working against him because he became essentially uncontrollable. Everyone else was controllable because they could be bought. But someone who didn't care about money, you know, when Jarnail Singh, when he last met his wife, he met her about a month before the attack. He told her, he said, I only have one request for you, is that after I'm gone, you don't take money from anybody. You'd be happy, even if you only have one prashadha, you'd be happy with that for our kids. That I don't want you to exploit my name for your financial gain. And her family, her and her sons have never done that. They've actually been really impressive on that. Other members of his family have, but not his wife and kids. And so that was the mentality of Baba Jarnail Singh, that even after I'm dead, I don't want my family exploiting the Panth for financial gain. Whereas the Akali Dal leadership was something else entirely. So Jarnail Singh became this figure that was really, for people, like an image of the great Gur Sikhs of the past. And in my opinion, I would say that having looked at Sikh history, I can see only two other Sikhs that compare to Baba Jarnail Singh in stature, being a military, social, political, and religious leader. And that would be Baba Maharaj Singh during the Anglo-Sikh Wars and Baba Banda Singh Bahadur. He was also, and if you listen to his speeches, they're sometimes really funny, because he'll go off for like 10 minutes about stop calling me Brahmgyani. How dare you? And like, don't call me son, and I can't handle this, I'm not a Brahmgyani, don't you know what a Brahmgyani is? He had a lot of health problems. I don't know if many of you know, and he had to have glucose intravenously. I'm not sure what his health issues were, but he was very weak in a lot of ways physically. And he's like, if someone was really a Brahmgyani means a great spiritually connected Sikh. He would say, he would say in his speeches that they'd be able to get up out of their bed, they wouldn't be as weak as I am, And we can see here that he saw his role as very much, he would say, my role is just to tell Sikhs what their position is in India and to tell the truth. That's what my job is, to speak the truth. There's nothing more. He had no desire to be a leader in that sense. And that's what made him a great leader. In the mold of those great Sikhs from the past, is that he didn't want to be a leader. One story that I like telling about it is that you guys have many times seen those videos and pictures of him walking around the Prakarma, right? So you always see this big group of guys behind him. This wasn't like a posse that he created. He just would do every morning the Prakarma, and people sort of started following him as he did it. And over time, by like 84, that group of young Sikhs got really big because everyone wanted to kind of hang out with Bhai Jarnail Singh, right? Now the big problem was that when he was walking by himself or just a few of his students, people would come up and try to matadik to him, which would really disturb him, especially being in the Darbar complex. And he would quickly walk away from them, kind of step. But once he had this big group of guys with him, he didn't know how to navigate around these people who were trying to matadik to him, right? So he kept rocks in his pocket, and he would throw them at people who were trying to matadik to him as he was doing prakarma. So as opposed to the Babas of today that want people to worship them, here's someone who actively tried to get people to stop. So that's the type of leader he was. So these are two great Sikhs. On the left is Santbir Singh Sodhi, and on the right is Santbir Singh, whose alias was General Hari Singh, and who became the head of the Khalsa Commando Force, which was the armed wing of the Khalsa Panth after Sarabjeet Khalsa in 1986. And these two Sikhs, Santbir Singh Sodhi was killed in 84 or late 83. Early 84. And Santbir Singh was shaheed in 87 or 88, after 84. What Jarnail Singh realized was that, looking at Sikh history, Sikh tradition, is that if we're being killed, if we're being assaulted, if our rights are being disrespected and we have no response and we cannot find justice, then it is our obligation to take justice into our own hands. So this is very similar to what Bhai Singh Rajwana did. It's that same mentality, it's the same thing that Sukhan Jinda did. And going back to Sikh history, it's the same thing that Bhai Sukhan Singh did with Masa Singh Rangar. This is a Sikh tradition to do. And that tradition is, if, let's say here in Canada, someone kills my wife, God forbid, and do I have the right to go and kill that individual? And I don't, because we have rule of law here. And I can expect that that person will be arrested and that they'll be put on trial. But in India, where there was no rule of law and where Sikhs were being killed, and young Sikh women were being raped, and Guru Granth Sahib Ji were being desecrated, and nobody's being charged with these crimes, and people are in fact being promoted, the people who are doing these crimes, if they're police officers, then the need is for us to take control into our own hands and to bring justice. So this is where people get uncomfortable, but I say that instead of being uncomfortable, we should be proud of this, because this is fulfilling the Sikh tradition, of the warrior tradition. And we can't be ashamed of this aspect of Sikh history. So Bhai Jarnail Singh created what were called the motorcycle wale, and these were young Sikhs who would go on motorcycles and who would target those police officials or those government officials who were directly responsible for killing innocent Sikhs or raping Sikh women. And Santbir Singh Sodhi was the leader of that group and was considered one of Bhai Jarnail Singh's right-hand men. Now, a common thing that a lot of people say is that Bhai Jarnail Singh was a Congress agent. Has anyone heard that before?
And I was going to go over that, during the talk we're going to have.
Yes.
But for my thesis, which was on Sikh literature, I had to go through, several books, and one is the long walk home from Manreed Surdi Someshwar.
Okay.
And she's trying to, let's say, to write the history of Punjab from the 1947 to the diaspora.
Okay.
And in there, she portrays Baba Jarnail Singh as a terrorist,
And
as an agent from the Congress government, but just like Frankenstein, you know, like if Indira Gandhi
like a creative
created him,
monster, yeah.
and
then
then
he got out of
she
control.
repressed it. Yeah, so I was gonna come to
Yeah,
this.
and we'll deal with that directly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Actually, there is a very interesting book being published recently on Sikh insurgency by, I think, Shima.
Okay.
He's a scholar in the United States, and he had this theory. And actually, it's very, I think it's very nuanced in a way. He has this theory about how forces in Indian politics led up. Actually, very much what you told about the Indian politics being on the basis of this, and not only the Sikhs being targeted at the time, and how Indira Gandhi and her electoral politics was so wicked to get all her things done to try to get like the Sikh votes, but at the same time also the Hindu votes in Punjab and things like that. And he actually claims that he has evidence for the fact that Indira Gandhi approached Jarnail Singh, and that he started off as
government. So
as not I would not say
or being promoted by the government.
I won't put the name the word agent in his mouth. I don't think he uses it, but most definitely the connection was there. And then he talks about how Baba Jarnail Singh would stand behind his standpoint and being very confident in his in bringing about this.
He wasn't able to be controlled. Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's
So this is a common theme that we hear, and it's become almost like a fact. It's been repeated so many times. And so they state that, and they, scholars, journalists, everyone, that Baba Jarnail Singh, when he first started, was promoted by Gyani Zail Singh, and then he got out of control of the Congress Party and sort of became rogue and was not able to be controlled. Very similar to like the narrative of bin Laden being supported by the US government as the other mullahs were to fight the Russians, and then kind of going and doing their own thing and then attacking America back, So we're going to look at this. A lot of this is based, ironically, on one photo. So in 1980, there was a funeral of a very important Panthik leader, important meaning he was very powerful, named Santbir Singh in Delhi. And at that funeral, Baba Jarnail Singh came because Taksal had been close with Santbir Singh. And also because it was Delhi and he was a powerful politician, Gyani Zail Singh was there too. So for those who don't know, Gyani Zail Singh was the chief minister of Punjab in the early 70s. He later was appointed president of India. So president of India is a governor general of Canada. It's a ceremonial position. And he was an old-time Congress politician who had gone to jail in the 30s and 40s fighting against the British. Now, Zail Singh was not the only Congress leader at the time. And his big rival was a guy named Darbana Singh. And Darbana Singh was also chief minister during this time. So as Zail Singh became the president of India and given the ceremonial position, Santbir Singh had come in, and they had for years not liked each other and would sort of try to undermine each other in the eyes of the Central Congress leadership. Now, Tarlochan Singh is, and I would say that he's probably the best person to comment on this issue because he is a Congress MP still today. He was the head of the Minorities Commission, which was this commission set up by the Indian government to sort of appease Sikhs and Muslims to show that they cared about them, but it was kind of a useless organization. And he used to be press secretary to Gyani Zail Singh in the 70s and was his right-hand man. And so he has, and you can find the article online where he fully details it, and he says fully that this was just a story created by Darbana Singh to malign Zail Singh, not to malign Jarnail Singh, but to make Zail Singh look bad in the eyes of Indira Gandhi. That's what it was. And we can see that it's a created artificial thing for a couple of reasons. First of all, because from 77 to 1980, Jarnail Singh's power was increased not because of Congress support, but because of his active campaign of going to villages and just preaching very basic Sikh principles. It wasn't a political message. And Jarnail Singh only really became, even after 78, after the Nekari massacre, Jarnail Singh was not involved. So if we look at Sikh Panthic history, the group that was involved more on the militant side after 78 was Babbar Khalsa. And they were the ones who were actively going out and trying to attack Nergadis and going against people who had been responsible for the 78 massacre, not Baba Jarnail Singh. Baba Jarnail Singh only became more involved in 1982 when a jeep, it really started with a jeep, with students of the Dundamit Taksal were arrested by the government. And by Harmeet Singh, Baba Jarnail Singh's right-hand man, was sent to deal with this situation in the court, and he was arrested then too. And then Baba Tara Singh, another older Sikh, was sent to deal with it, and he was arrested too. When Baba Jarnail Singh saw the students being arrested, he said, I'm going to start a protest movement against this. It's ridiculous. They've been arrested on no charges. And that's really where the movement started. And only as that movement became more powerful did the Akali Dal align themselves with his movement. So that's really the root of it. So nowhere in there is a Congress. Now, there is, and it's very hard to deal with this fact, but it seems to be, because even Dorotisa talks about it, that the Dal Khalsa, which is a Panthic party, a lot of people state that it was a creation of Gyani Zail Singh. And it was created by him to counteract the Gali power. And a lot of people in that time period may have misconstrued Dal Khalsa was Baba Jarnail Singh. But Dal Khalsa was really just a bunch of students like us sitting around. Sorry guys, that's very fast. Let me turn my record off. So Dal Khalsa was a bunch of students who I feel that were really idealistic and were really inspired by Sardar Kapoor Singh actually, and who may have been manipulated by Zail Singh and promoted by him. But their later conduct to me looks to be authentically Panthic. But they were never working with Baba Jarnail Singh. They were never like closely working with him. They protested and they respected him, but they weren't like his group or anything of that nature. So this Congress agent thing is very hard to contradict now because it's been repeated so many times. And the problem is that it first started as rumors back in the 80s. And so when you're talking about rumors that are so old and then got repeated by the news media, so that when academic sources, when they talk about Jarnail Singh, they have to use the media accounts at the time, and the media accounts always say that he was a government agent, so then it just gets repeated ad nauseum, right? So it's very difficult to contradict this, but what we can see is from Jarnail Singh's own behavior and from what Congress, if he was a Congress-created politician, created creature to sort of subvert the Akali Dal, then they did a really bad job of it because he was fully behind the Akali Dal up until late 83 when, as he grew more and more powerful, the Akali Dal actually had Surinder Singh Sodhi killed. And it was only that Baba Jarnail Singh broke from the Akali leadership. So we're going to now turn away from 84 and look back at Panthic history. And we're going to look at those sort of claims. You know, why were they armed in the Darbar Sahib complex? Why did they let the attack happen there? Why didn't they fight somewhere else? Or why did they give themselves up for arrest? Why would they let such a sacred place be desecrated? And I want to talk about that first of all, the idea of sacred space. So first Sikhs, what does the word Onkaar mean? It means that Vaheguru Akal Purkh exists everywhere, in all things, at all times, equally. That's what Bhai Mantra teaches us, right? That Ad Sach, Jagad Sach, Hepi Sach, Nanak Hosi Pi Sach. That always true, always there, even before time was created, right? So for Sikhs, whereas Darbar Sahib is important, Akal Takht Sahib is important, every space is important for us because every space contains Vaheguru. And that's what the Sakhi of Makkah is, right? When Guru Nanak went to Makkah, that's what Guru Nanak was trying to teach the people of Makkah, right? So this idea of a place that's so sacred that we can't let it be destroyed or damaged, that doesn't fall in line with Sikh thinking. And we can see from the Guru time period, Guru Hargobind Sahib Ji abandoned Amritsar. Guru Gobind Singh Ji abandoned Anandpur Sahib. These places were important, but they were not more important than the principle of Sikhi. That's something to keep in mind. So in Diwali of 1757, Ahmad Shah Abdali, who was the king of Afghanistan, invaded India, South Asia for the upteenth time. I don't know which invasion number it was. I think it was the 7th or the 6th invasion of South Asia. And on his invasions, he had been harassed by the Sikhs many times. And Sikhs would actively, we know what they would do, even though they're living in jungles and poor and downtrodden, they would actively go out and free people. They would steal back the money that was being stolen and the jewels that they would distribute to poor people in their Robin Hood mentality. They would take the sex slaves that were being taken, the young boys that were being taken as slaves, back to Central Asia to be sold in the markets of Kandahar and Kabul, and they would free them and take them back to their homes. And that's what the Baltic response was to these invasions. And so Abdali couldn't understand why Sikhs were so powerful. He said they live on horses, they live in the jungle, they don't have proper food, they don't have villages, we've destroyed everything of theirs, they're living like animals, and they still keep attacking us. So from his thinking, he thought that it must be a Darbar Sahib. He said that the Darbar Sahib, the complex, Harmeet Sahib, had a magical power to it. And the Sarovar was magical. And because of the Sarovar, the Khalsa had strength. So he thought, if I destroy the Sarovar, if I destroy the Harmeet Sahib, if I destroy Kaltakat, then I will be able to destroy the Khalsa Panth. So he blew up Harmeet Sahib. He filled up the tank of the Bar Sahib with animal carcasses, and he raised a Kaltakat Sahib. Now, after the attack had happened, because the Panth wasn't even there at the time, news came, and this was, of course, way before social media, so it took a while to get to the Baba Deep Singh, who lived in South Punjab in the jungle area of what is Damdamasa, where he had a small school where he would teach Sikhi and write Guru Granth Sahib Sarabjeet. He was an old man by this time. Baba Deep Singh very simply got his students together and he started to march to Amritsar, saying that I'm not going to stop until I have shown the Afghanis that even though they've destroyed the Bar Sahib, the Sikhs will still respond. On principle that we must respond when our institutions are desecrated and destroyed. And as he marched along the way, other Sikhs joined him. And if you go to Amritsar area today, there's gurdwaras on the way. Do you know that gurdwara when you go to Tarn where you have to matha take from the car? Does everyone know that one? So that's, what? Yeah, that's related to the Baba Deep Singh time period, to that march from Damdama to Amritsar. So there's all these little places where they stopped on, you know, the place where he drew the line in the sand. That's another gurdwara, I forgot his name as well. Oh, sorry. So in the end, the Khalsa army came, and Baba Deep Singh, of course, was shaheed, and other Sikhs, many other Sikhs were shaheed. But they showed the Afghanis that even though they really, like, there's no point in fighting at this point. We have to understand the mentality. All the damage had already been done. The point was, we need to take a stand. Now, about a decade later, this is Baba Gurmat Singh, who was actually the next head of the Damdami itself. Abdali invaded South Asia again, and the Khalsa Panth actually had a meeting because they knew that Abdali would come to Amritsar and he would try to destroy the Bar Sahib and the complex again. And so the Khalsa Panth actually made a decision through the consensus democracy we used to have in Sarabjeet Khalsa, and they decided as a community that we are going to abandon Amritsar. We're going to go to the jungles and to the mountains because it's better to fight a guerrilla warfare campaign where we can strike quickly at the enemy than to face them head on because we'll just get wiped out. So they were smart about it. But one guy stood up. Baba Gurmat Singh stood up at the end of this about Khalsa, and he asked the rest of the Khalsa, he said, I don't want to disrespect the Guru Panth, but I ask only that I be given permission to stay here to show the enemy that we don't give up our institutions completely. So he stated a small group of volunteers was allowed to stay with him, 36. So we need to really, this incident is very comparable to what happened in '84.